Welcome. This is section 4 of All Things Have Standing, and this section of the course will focus on AI ethics. Hello, I'm Wendell Wallach, and I'm a scholar at the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, where I chaired technology and ethics studies for 11 years. I'm also a fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, where with my colleague Anya Kasperson, I co-direct an AI and equality initiative. Robots and AI systems provide a mirror, however imperfect, that reflects the ways in which we humans are truly similar, but also may differ from the artificial entities we create. The encroachment of robots and AI systems on more and more human activities has highlighted the question as to what it will mean to be human in this technological age, and what functions we will continue to fulfill, or whether perhaps we have begun inventing the human species as we have known it, if not out of existence, at least into a minor role. The prospects of creating moral machines that are sensitive to ethical considerations and capable of factoring these into their choices and actions, has provided a particularly fruitful pathway in these reflections about both human nature and what is possible with artificial intelligence. We are a long way from having super intelligent machines such as our heroine in the Spark Hunter file. And we're a long way from creating artificial intelligence that has moral intelligence, that has semantic understanding, that has emotional intelligence, that has imagination and creativity, that has the capacity for empathy. Each of these capabilities is extremely complex. And because of the difficulties of implementing them within AI systems, I'm among those who characterize myself as a friendly skeptic. I'm friendly to the can-do engineering spirit that says remarkable possibilities lie in our future, and many will be realized. But I'm skeptical that we know enough about intelligence to implement it computationally. Nevertheless, the computers, robots, and other systems we are creating increasingly demonstrate autonomy. That means they have the capacity to move around and make decisions with little or no direct human input. And it is because of this that we need to begin thinking about how to ensure that in their autonomous activities, these systems take actions that we consider appropriate, just, and ethical. Now, today, the kinds of ethics that you see in the robots or the AI bots that are being deployed, it's largely what we call operational ethics, meaning that the engineers have in advance figured out what are the situations that system will encounter, considering these systems tend to function in relatively limited or constrained environments. And they have hard programmed what the system should do when it encounters each of those situations. The values instantiated in these choices, those are largely the values of the companies that the engineers work for, or whoever has designed and deployed the AI systems. But we are rapidly moving into a realm where we need what we refer to as functional morality. That's because the engineers already cannot always predict what situations new systems will encounter, and therefore the systems are going to need some kinds of ethical subroutines to at least deal with the variations that appear in the limited context they function. Now, what most people would love to talk about, and what's a wonderful philosophical exercise for us, is the advent of AI systems with full moral agency, with full moral sensitivity, such as our hero in the Spark Hunter file, who seems at times to display a degree of awareness, intelligence that goes beyond that of most humans. The founder and director of the Center for Affective Computing at MIT put it well when she said, "The greater the autonomy of the system, the more it will need moral standards." The development of moral machines is driven by 4 questions. The first is, do we really need them? When? For what? The second one is, do we really want machines making morally sensitive decisions, particularly decisions that might cause harm for others? A third question is the obvious one. Long-standing debate as whose ethics or what ethics should prevail, whose ethics or what ethics should be implemented in the moral machines. And of course, there's no requirement that the same ethics are used in all situations. The fourth question, and the one we're going to primarily focus on in the remainder of this course, is whether ethical decision-making and sensitivity to ethical considerations can actually be implemented computationally. Do we have the kinds of platforms where this makes sense? Or might ethical decision-making be something that is uniquely human? When we talk about building moral machines, the first thought that comes to most people's minds is Isaac Asimov and his 3 laws of robots. And they ask, well, didn't he already give us the basic criteria for decision-making in computational systems? It's important to note that before Asimov outlined his laws, nearly every science fiction story about a robot ends with the robot in one form or another destroying its creator. But a few science fiction writers had begun to write stories about robots being good. And Asimov did the same and started to think through, well, what would it take for robots to be good? And with his 3 laws, he radically altered the trajectory of science fiction. Now, many of you know these 3 laws. In effect, they say the robot should not harm a human, the robot should obey the human, the robot should engage in self-preservation. And these 3 laws are arranged hierarchically so that the first one, not harming humans, trumps the second and the third. The second trumps the third. They seem very straightforward, very rational. But interestingly enough, in nearly every additional story that Asimov wrote, and he ended up writing over 80 stories about robots, in nearly every story he demonstrates how things could go awry with a robot just programmed with these basic laws. For example, what does a robot do if 2 humans give it conflicting instructions? How does the robot know how to deal with that? Would a robot understand that a medic with a knife in his hand on a field over a wounded soldier was trying to help that soldier, not kill that soldier? Later in his life, Isaac Asimov considered problems that might arise if you had superintelligent machines. And therefore, he added a zeroth law. His zeroth law largely states that the robot, either through its actions or its inaction, should not allow humanity to come to harm. So again, that presumes pretty high level of understanding of what the situation is and what the robot could and could not do. How important are human ethics? And are they a good tool to help us build robots that act in ways that are appropriate, safe, and just? When we think of human ethics, we think largely in terms of values, norms, principles, and procedures. Values and valuing, they pervade everything. A value can be as simple as a simple valence, and tendency to like or dislike something or someone. or it could be a preference. Norms are context sensitive, and there may be a very different norm for what you do at a four-way stop sign if you have somebody already in the intersection or if people are crossing the street. There's a context there, and you as a driver understand that context. And we would expect any self-driving car that is going to be permitted to be on the street also understands at least those basic contexts, even if it can't understand some of the more difficult challenges. Principles are often much greater, much broader. They may have to do with the protection of privacy, or they may have to do with the fact that one should not kill, or if one kills, it can only be in very special circumstances. And then in ethics, there are procedures. How do you make decisions in certain contexts, particularly contexts where there are wickedly difficult ethical challenges to address? Since the dawn of the Enlightenment era, going back to the 17th and 18th century, there's been a great deal of emphasis placed on ethical decision-making rooted in our capacity to reason. And there are two broad tenets that look at reasoning and its application to decision-making. One tenet is really thousands of years old, and that's that what's right, good, and just is simply derived from following the rules or from doing your duty. And that was perhaps the most powerful form of ethics until roughly the later 1700s, when Jeremy Bentham came up with a new ethical theory. And his new ethical theory was based on the principle that the choices you make should be the ones leading to the greatest happiness. Now, sometimes the word happiness gets changed out with words like the greatest welfare, the greatest well-being. But the basic principle here is that what is right, just, and good is not determined by the rules, but it's determined by looking at the consequence of the action or of the various choices of actions you can make and selecting the one that leads to the greatest good for the greatest number. These two forms of ethics, following the rules, which is often known as a deontological ethical system, deontology being a word going back to the Greeks and standing for duty, and consequentialism, they've been duking it out for more or less the last 150, 200 years, and many people prescribe to one or the other. There has, however, always been a third tradition within ethics, and that tradition dates back to Aristotle in Greece, dates back to the Buddha in India, and dates back to Confucius in China. And that's virtue ethics. Virtue ethics basically argues that what is right and good and just is what a virtuous person would do, what a moral exemplar would do. And the teaching within virtue ethics is largely how you go through developing character, developing appropriate habits, developing ways of automatically acting with the most appropriate intent in every situation you encounter. The safety, acceptability, and trustworthiness of an artificial intelligence will depend upon its ability to factor the ethical considerations that we have been discussing and take actions that we consider appropriate. What role might ethical theory play in the design of such an artificial intelligence system? Well, when you think of this question, you tend to think of two different approaches. One is a top-down approach, where an ethical theory or a bunch of rules help us delineate what is right and appropriate. So those rules, for example, could be the 10 Commandments, or they might even be Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. or they could be the Human Rights Declaration of the UN. They could be a system of ethics that applied within a particular community or within a particular country. Now, the advantage of such an approach, if you could implement the rules in effectively, is that the rules can be very broad, and they therefore will cover a vast number of cases. So you don't have to program for each situation that the system might encounter. The disadvantage is they may be defined so broadly that their application to specific cases is very debatable. And to make matters worse, people, even when they agree on the values, often prioritize those values very differently. So all of these become problematic in implementing a top-down theory. Now, some top-down theories are not so much a bunch of rules, but they may be a principle. So consequentialism, the greatest good for the greatest number, that's a process, that's a principle. And Immanuel Kant is quite famous for having created a law that he thinks helps us in deducing what all the other rules are that we should follow. Therefore, it's a one law approach to deontology. And his one law was a categorical imperative, a law that could help us determine whether various principles could be universalized. The Golden Rule is another example of one rule that is sometimes thought to trump every other rule. And the Golden Rule does exist in nearly every culture in one form or another. The other approach you might come upon would be a bottom-up approach. Most of us did not come into the world sensitive to ethical considerations. Most children don't come into the world in that way. They learn about what's acceptable, what's appropriate. And it may vary from growing up in one culture to growing up in another culture. In a bottom-up approach, you try through either a learning regime or an array of experiences, or even a kind of evolutionary approach where the best solutions prevail. You try and help the system in discovering itself what is right, good, and just. The advantages of this bottom-up learning approach, as we see with our children, is that it can be very robust. It can integrate inputs from all kinds of different sources, so it can be very dynamic in that regard. But the disadvantage is it can be extremely hard to put forward what the goal is that you are trying to achieve or maximize. Let us make a fundamental distinction between humans and AI systems. Humans evolved. We are largely biochemical systems for whom emotions play a central role. AI systems from the get-go are founded on a logical platform. And if they have emotions at all, they're likely to be just mechanical determinations as opposed to actually feeling anything. This provides certain advantages for AI. It may be better than most humans in applying logical approaches for determining what's right and good. Furthermore, it is not bound rationally the way humans are. A lot of research has shown that we humans can factor more or less 7, 8, 9 different elements into a choice that we make. A computer could potentially factor in much more information. The other characteristic that gives computer systems an advantage is they don't have emotions, such as rage, fear, anger, that can derail the appropriateness of the action that they are going to take. So they aren't subject to emotional hijackings. But we now live in the age where emotions aren't all bad. There was a school of thought, and it's still alive today, but it dates back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, called Stoicism, which which felt that the best decision makers were those who could expunge their emotions, who could make decisions without emotional interference. Not everybody believed that. Aristotle thought it was welcome to have the right emotion in the right place at the right time. Spinoza, Hume, others thought that emotions actually could contribute to good decision making, particularly if you had moral sentiments such as empathy that guided your action. And we, of course, today live in the world of emotional intelligence. We place a great deal of importance on the cultivation of good sentiments, of moral sentiments. We place a great deal of emphasis on self-control. We place a great deal of emphasis on being able to express the appropriate emotion in the right place at the right time, and being able to read the emotions of others. These are all different factors that come into play in emotional intelligence. And therefore, we presume that the best decision makers are also going to be those who have emotional intelligence. The importance of emotional intelligence here is that it emphasizes at least one quality beyond the capacity to reason that you might want to have within your moral machine to ensure that it acts appropriately in all situations. Getting emotional intelligence is not going to be easy. You might be able to create something that we call computational emotions, whereby in a decision the right weight is placed on one choice over another because we understand there's an emotional input there, but we have no idea how to create somatic emotions, the capacity to feel. And how important is that capacity to feel? So emotions have gotten us thinking about a vast array of other capabilities that reason alone does not account for. It's not just emotions, but it's sociability, the drive to be social, to know about how to function in a social context. It's about the application of particular emotions, such as empathy. It's about consciousness and what we sometimes refer to as a theory of mind. The theory of mind is our capacity to deduce that what's in somebody else's mind differs from what's in my mind, and it's important for me to know that difference in order to effectively operate with others or to understand how my actions might affect them. So these additional capabilities we've referred to as super-rational, beyond the capacity to reason. And the project of developing moral machines has increasingly underscored the importance of these capabilities. These are all capabilities that hitherto, other than emotions, we more or less took for granted because all humans had them. And it's these capacities which have also helped us begin to think much more comprehensively about human decision-making and ethics than it had been before. In section 2 of AI ethics, we're going to look at the prospect of creating hybrid machines, machines that bring together these three elements: top-down, bottom-up, and super-rational capabilities. And we'll talk a bit more about the importance of these capabilities beyond reasoning for making good judgments.